Welcome. I'm Dr. Owen Anderson, and I'm a professor of philosophy, and especially the philosophy of religion. And so I'm often asked, can you prove that God exists? And not just can you, like some general you prove it, but can you prove that God exists? Because one of the things I work on is this. Not only does God exist, it's clear that God exists, so that unbelief is without excuse. So you should be able to not only prove it, you're required to do so. So we're going to go through a proof for God's existence and also that idea, though, because someone could say, sure, there's proofs, but they're really hard. They're like advanced calculus, and the normal person can't know that. So they just have to rely on what the Bible says or what their grandparents told them, something like that. So what does it even mean to prove God exists, and why would we want to do that? So the idea that you can prove God exists is in contrast to skepticism, which is the belief that you can't know. And there could be religious skeptics and irreligious skeptics. So the irreligious skeptic might say, you can't know if God exists. You shouldn't live like there's a God. It's a fantasy. The religious skeptic could say, yeah, sure, you can't know God exists. No one can. And God's beyond human comprehension. To try to know God is like putting him in a box. And so God is just the thing that's greater than everything else. And that then becomes the next thing called fideism, blind faith. You just have to believe some things. And what's interesting is, of course, any religion can advocate fideism of its beliefs. And not every religion believes in God. Most don't. So fideism isn't just like pro belief in God. It's pro whatever the person advancing it is. So sometimes you might hear Christian apologists speak as if you show skepticism is false, you prove fideism, and you've got Christianity. It's far from that. You'd have to show that you should be a fideist of Christianity and not a fideist of something else. So why do we need a proof? What's a proof? Well, in a proof, we're showing that a proposition is true by giving an argument. That's what a proof is. And an argument consists of premises that support a conclusion. And that conclusion is the proposition we want to prove is true. So in this case, God exists, or God, better, because a proposition has the word is. Here it's hidden. Really, that means this: God is real. So you're saying that's true. And I know it's true. And so I can prove that it's true. Let me do that now. Here's the premises that lead up to it. And so you might have like almost, what's interesting is the fideist might end up trying to give a kind of proof like, God's real because you have to believe something. And if you don't believe this, your life has no meaning. It's a really nice story. But that's a kind of argument. It's just an unsound argument. So I should add that in here. We want a sound argument, which means this. It is valid, which means this, the second definition. If the premises are true, the conclusion is true. And the premises are true, which would mean, do the argument, do the inference for me. If the premises are true, the conclusion is true, and the premises are true, therefore, the conclusion is true. And we have a rational obligation to believe the conclusion of a sound argument. How do we feel about it? For some reason, you might say, I don't feel good about that argument. So if it's a sound argument, you got to believe the conclusion. So what we're not doing, we're not asking how someone feels about God's existence, right? There could be a whole psychology, a whole background history where someone says, yeah, this person who believed that God exists was really mean to me. And so now I associate belief in God's existence with this person being mean to me. Okay, I mean, that could be true, but that's just not what we're dealing with here. How do you feel about, or someone could be the opposite. Yeah, man, God always makes me feel like so happy when I think about it. Well, yeah, but there could be true things, or there could be things that make you feel happy and they're not true. So that's also still not what we're asking about, how you feel. There's no direct connection between what you feel and the truth of the matter. We're not asking if people have a sense or are aware of God, sometimes called the sensus divinitatis. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. I mean, I guess you would do a poll. Most people I know who believe in this say it's true because the Bible says so. I'm not sure the Bible does say that. But if you go around, you could do a poll. You could go around and ask people and see if they actually have this sense or not. And if you're saying all people have always had this sense, then you'd have to be able to go back in time and ask all people who ever lived. So we're not doing that. One way or the other, maybe they have a sense, maybe they don't. Maybe they're aware of God, maybe they're not. We're asking a different question. Can I prove God is real, is true? And we're also not asking if people know of God. Someone could say everyone knows of God. They just reject him. I mean, that's kind of like the second one, although maybe here they are switching from a sense. Incidentally, number 2 and 1 and 2 are about senses, which aren't propositions. You're doing an inference when you say, yeah, I always feel happy, therefore God is real, or I have a sense of the ultimate, therefore it's God. That's an argument. It just happens to be an unsound argument because it could mean other things. I always have a sense of the ultimate, therefore dopamine is released in my brain. It doesn't follow. Your argument doesn't follow. So there's a distinction between my sense and the proposition God is real. So we're trying to see how can we prove the proposition God is real is true. So we're also not asking if everyone knows that proposition already. Again, that would be like, well, how would you know? And someone say, well, the Bible says so. That doesn't seem to me that's not what it's talking about. But if you were to say, well, no, everyone knows God, you'd have to again do a poll, like everyone on earth right now. Ask them. You get a clipboard, piece of paper, and say, can you do you know of the proposition God is real, and can you prove it's true? And you'd have to go back in time and ask everybody. So, I mean, that seems dubious, but again, we're not even talking about that one way or the other. If somehow everyone knows of God, they still don't know this. And we're looking for that. So to know that God exists means that a person believes God is real. This is what to know means. You believe there's a proposition, God is real, and you believe it, which means you think it's true. And it is true. Indeed, God is real. And you can show it's true because you could have these first two and not have knowledge. That's called a true opinion. You could just get lucky, right? I could write a bunch of propositions and put them in a hat. You pick one out and it turns out to be a true one and you believe it, but you don't know how many just picked it out. That's random. So what makes it knowledge then is that you can indeed show that God is real. And I think we'd expect this. I mean, a lot of times, unfortunately, people spend all their energy in trying to get out of that obligation. Most of the recent Christian epistemology on this point is trying to get around it by saying, no, I don't have to do that. I just have to believe it properly. And we'll see how when you look at that, it's called externalism, the person still ends up having to show that their externalism is true. You can't get around the obligation to show your belief is true. Why should we believe externalism? As soon as they give an answer, they're involved in an internalist argument. So instead of spending our time trying to get out of it, let's just accept it and say, yeah, we don't want to be skeptics or fideists. We don't want to change the definition of knowledge to something else that's easier so I don't have to show it. This is what we expect in any area of life. If you're interviewing someone for a job, say you want them to lay floor tile, and they say, yeah, I know all about floor tile. And you say, well, do you believe you have to have the cement down first? No, I don't believe that. Do you believe you need to put straight lines down before you start laying tile? No, I don't believe that. I mean, any ordinary things you need to do to lay floor tile. And they say they know how to do it, but they don't believe any of the things that you need to do are true. Well, then what sense do they know it? And you could do that for anything. We would expect someone, if you claim to know it, then you believe it's true and you can show it. Now, with something like floor tile, that switches to, we'll talk about in a minute, knowing how. So someone could say, I can't explain it, just let me show you, and they would do it. But that's a proof. And that still proves my point, which is we want proof. If you know it, prove it. I can't tell you how to ride a bike, but let me show you, watch this, and you'd ride a bike. So now it's God's existence. Someone might take that and say, look, I can't really put it into words, but watch my life. And I'll show you that God exists. The only problem with that would be that that same life could be explained in other ways. So you haven't yet shown it. So the idea that, so let me go back here. It was answering some objections, but to know that God exists means this. You believe God exists, or God is real, and God is indeed real. That's true. Your belief is true, and you can show it. That's what it means to know. If you're using some different definition of know, which we already covered up here, then what we're going over isn't what you're interested in. But you could have these feelings, a sensus, and you don't actually have knowledge. You think God is real, and God may not be real. Your feelings don't prove God is real. So this is different from knowing of God. Like the atheist, sometimes I've heard people say, atheists know God. I told him all about God. Okay, so he knows of God. Just like I know of atheism, I just don't think it's correct. So they don't know God. They know of what the Christian or the theist teaches. Knowing how is different also. That's non-cognitive or not propositional, right? So I know how to ride a bike, but I can't put it into words. In that sense, you could say animals know how to do something. Computers know how to do something. It's a non-cognitive, non-propositional knowing. And what we're talking about now is propositional, cognitive. I'm aware of a belief and I think it's true. The unbeliever doesn't do that. So for all the people who will say, everyone knows God already. No, they don't. They don't believe the proposition God is real is true. And that's a part of knowing. You believe it's true. You're aware of your belief and you think it's true. So you could appeal, someone could say, well, but they're deceiving themselves. And here's what that usually means is they're living as if God is real because they live as if morality is real and there are ultimate purposes. But then they say there is no God, and that's inconsistent. Yeah, that's true. So there is an inconsistency there, but they still don't know God. You could say more accurate is this, they presuppose God is real, yes, but they're not aware of that, and they should be. They're culpably ignorant. They're negligent. They haven't done what they should have done, and that's inexcusable. So that's all that's different. It's different than knowing how I said that or being acquainted. Again, someone could say, well, God's a person. You don't, like when you're getting to know somebody, you don't just write down propositions about them. You interact with them and you can recognize them. And recognizing someone is not proposition. Like when you see a friend and you see their face, you don't have like 10 propositions. You go down a list. Oh yeah, it is you. So that's what God's more like. You just realize, you just experience God. So that's back to the feelings. And again, the problem with that view was what you feel is God. Someone else has the same feeling and they say it's something different. How do you know which one's right? Maybe you're wrong and the other person's right. And even those relationships do have propositions. You have a friend and you can recognize your friend, but you would also say, hey, my friend is real. And this other guy says, no, he's an imaginary friend. No, he's not, he's real. And so you would give a proof, including you could just introduce them. Here, friend, hey, he's real. But that's a proof. So what proof do you have that what you claim to be acquainted with is true? That's what we're looking at right now. And now in order to know that God is real, in contrast to fictional, a fantasy, we need to know what is God. So I'm speaking within the context of Christian theism. So we use the Westminster Shorter Catechism, question 4. What is God? Well, God's a spirit, infinite, eternal, and unchanging, in being, wisdom, power, holiness, goodness, justice, and truth. So 3 parts of the definition. The kind of substance God is, what are called the incommunicable attributes and the communicable attributes, the properties of God. So we'll look at those each briefly. This is what we need to do. If we're going to prove God exists, we need to prove this proposition is true. When you say God is real, the word God there is shorthand, so to speak, for this. So to say that God is real is to say that God, or is spirit, is to say God is not material. God is conscious, not made of stuff. He's immaterial. So in that sense, God's everywhere and nowhere. That's how Augustine put it. In this sense, it might seem like he's contradicting himself. He's not. God's everywhere. God's conscious of all things more than we are even. All things. So he's everywhere, but he's also nowhere. It's not as if he's sitting right there. Because then, interestingly, if you're right here, you're not aware of all things. So God is conscious, not material, not a material stuff. Next, we said these are called the incommunicable attributes of God. Infinite, eternal, unchanging. And by incommunicable, I mean cannot be given to a creature. God alone has these. And they go together. They can't be separated. If you have one, you have the other two. You can't have two of them, but not the third one. What has existed from eternity is that in which there is no greater and is neither growing nor decreasing, because it's already that in which there is no greater. You can't get more. And so that's infinite. Eternal is existed from eternity. That in which there's no greater, infinite, not growing or decreasing, unchanging. So we begin with that eternal one, because once you have what's eternal, you have infinite and unchanging. And that God, let's say God alone, has existed from eternity. This is the eternal power of God displayed in the things that are made. When you see the world, you realize it's temporal, dependent, not self-maintaining, not eternal. It tells you, I exist, but I haven't always existed, which means something else is eternal. God alone is eternal. And this distinguishes God, as we've defined God here, from what Plato or Aristotle or Plotinus speak about, these sorts of philosophers. And sometimes Christian apologists get excited because one of these philosophers will say something like the material world is not eternal, or I shouldn't say that, that's what they do say. There's not only the material world, there's something besides the material world. And Christians think, this is great, this is a proof for God's existence. No, it's not. That's a proof for dualism, that two things have existed from eternity. And that's what they said. They said either that God is co-eternal with the world, or even like with Plotinus, all is God. And so sometimes Christians seem to think that if some philosopher spoke of God or tried to prove God exists, that this is closer to Christianity than is the materialist. They'll say as long as they're not a materialist, they're doing great. Not so. They're equally inexcusable. Dualism, which denies the creator, is without excuse. You should know the material world had a beginning. And Aristotle denied that. Plato denied that. So the philosophers didn't get close to God, and they're without excuse. They need redemption. So you could be equally far from God, even though you say not everything's matter. It all depends on what you mean by God. So now let's get to the proof. We've done some preliminary work. All right, Anderson, how do you prove God exists? Well, we had to ask what we're proving. What is a proof? Why do we need one? So now let's get to it. Here I'll give an outline of how to prove that God exists. And I have videos on each of these steps in my philosophy class. So you can see my Patreon account, Dr. Owen Anderson, for more information about that class. If you want to see videos on 1 through 7, I've got them. Now, that's not just a way of saying, hey, I like to get paid. No, but I put effort into these things, and that gives you the ability to interact with me and ask questions. But I've got more of this material, and I think you'd like it. I think you should look into that and subscribe on Patreon. But what will we do? Well, we would do this. This is what you'd have to show. To prove that God exists, as defined back up here, you'll need to show this. Something is eternal. Something has existed from eternity. Because you won't get off the ground to prove God exists if nothing has existed from eternity, if everything came into existence yesterday. You're going to prove something is eternal. There are some cosmologists today who might say, no, there was a singularity and then the universe, and it came from nothing. Nothing's eternal. So we got to look at that and see, is that possible? Second, that the material world exists. Now, a lot of times Western philosophers will just think, no, that's common sense. Everyone knows the world exists. Not so. In fact, the major world religions have all said the world doesn't exist. And there are important idealistic philosophies in the West that say the material world doesn't exist. It's all mind. So is there even a material world, a creation that reveals the creator? It's interesting. They'll deny not only the creator exists, they'll even deny there is a creation. They'll deny the works of the creator. So to prove God exists, interestingly, you need to prove the material world does exist, but also then third, it's not eternal. It hasn't existed from eternity. Next, that spirit or mind exists. If God's a spirit, you'd have to show that spirit exists, because there are those, the materialists, who say, no, all is matter. Just like on number 2, I mentioned, there's those who say, no, all is mind. So you need to prove that spirit or mind exists. But then 5, show that not all spirit is eternal. Because there are those, including Plato, who say the human soul has existed from eternity. So you got to be able to show, no, the material world was made and I was made. Not all things are eternal. which then gets us to this. What we would know at that point is we would know that something's eternal and it's a spirit. And you would then show how whatever's eternal is infinite, eternal, and unchanging together, and would have knowledge. Spirits have knowledge. God is good in virtue of being the creator. God determines what is good, what is the nature of things. God has power, infinite power. What's eternal is the most powerful thing there is, brings things into existence. So under 6, we would flesh out the attributes of God. But then I think we still would need to do number 7, which is respond to the major objection to theism, the problem of evil. Someone will say, well, no, wait a minute. Even if we get to number 6, evil, show there can be no God. And I think what we would do once you've solved the problem of evil, what we see is not only does the problem of evil not show there is no God, it deepens the revelation of the glory of God. All the works, including the redemptive works of God, reveal God and display his glory. So to deny that there's a God or that God can be known is without excuse. To say that something else is eternal, matter's eternal, I'm eternal, both of those are eternal is without excuse. And we're held responsible to know who God is as revealed in his works. Now, someone could say, this is a response to the question. This is too difficult, Anderson. Now, I don't think it is. It's pretty step by step. I'm pretty sure I could go through this like in a 5th grade class. They love this kind of stuff, asking these questions. So I don't think it is too difficult. Maybe for someone who's neglected thinking for a long time, it would be difficult. But that's a subjective claim. This is really difficult is a subjective claim, right? You can imagine someone who's not been exercising, going for a walk for a quarter mile around their block, and that was really difficult. I mean, it's not really difficult, but you're out of shape. This stuff's not that difficult. Let's sharpen our minds. But let's say someone was to say that, no, it's really difficult. Well, I mean, according to Genesis 1-3, the first test in human history was about this. God lied, which means he's not perfect in goodness and knowledge. And you can be gods. You can determine good and evil for yourself. And they failed this test. And God didn't show up and say, hey, that was a rough one. That was a tough test. Let's just try again. We'll scrap that test. I'll give you a little bit easier question. No, they were plunged into spiritual death and had the imposition of the curse from dust, physical death. From dust you came, to dust you shall return, to get them to stop and think about what they've done. So this is the very first things we should be thinking about. What I'm suggesting is not the height of a Gnostic ladder of knowledge that once you finally get to the top, you can begin to reflect on the speculative philosophical analysis of being in itself. No, I'm talking about the very first things. And really, this is the very first kind of things kids ask. Where's stuff come from? What am I? What happens to me? These are all the questions people ask right from the beginning. This is just the first things that we would want to know, we would want to teach our children. It's clear that God exists, not difficult philosophical speculation. Can we prove that God exists? Well, our claims about redemption require that we can. If we need to be redeemed from unbelief, if unbelief is inexcusable, and notice that, unbelief, meaning they don't know it. If unbelief is inexcusable, then it must be clear that God exists. But isn't that too complicated? I've sort of been answering this one for the ordinary person. Well, it wasn't too complicated for our first parents. They were held responsible. And they had no formal education. They didn't say, wait, I haven't had Philosophy 501 yet, where we go over the metaphysics of Platonic forms, right? No, this is basic thinking stuff. If you can think, you can know there are no uncaused events. You can know something is eternal. You can know that the material world runs down, and so it hasn't always existed or would have already run down. You can know that your soul had a beginning, because had you existed from eternity, you would have infinite knowledge, and you don't have infinite knowledge. Really simple stuff. I've basically just given nutshell forms of what we'll do in the arguments. So we can and should know that God exists, and that this is revealed in all of his works of creation and providence. We should be able to show that and respond to the common objections. You can know without showing it. Everyone has a sense of the divine. Everyone's aware of, everyone knows of. It's too difficult. All these excuses. That's what without excuse means. Or It just gives me a vague shadow. I have to be told in the Bible. It's interesting. People reduce the Bible to being told. It's too hard to figure out. I got to just be told it. That's sad, right? Even the Bible's not like that. I don't think that's what the Bible does. The Bible requires us to figure out all kinds of things. It puts this and this, and we got to infer something. But people just want to be told. No, you've been given a mind. You've been given the ability to make inferences, to go from a premise to a conclusion. So all of those things I just mentioned are attempts at an excuse. And we're told unbelief is without excuse. We should be able to show that this is true from general revelation. So thanks for joining me, and I look forward to studying with you more.